The sound wasn't just a crash. It was a detonation of glass and porcelain that silenced the entire cafeteria. A silver tray hit the polished terrazzo floor, sending a spray of orange juice and pasta sauce painting the pristine white tiles in a violent, abstract art of humiliation. E.J. Whitmore froze, his breath hitching in a throat suddenly too tight to swallow. He reached out instinctively, his fingers grasping for the aluminum support that served as his third leg, but his hand closed around empty air. Above him, the fluorescent lights of the Crestwood Academy cafeteria seemed to sharpen, turning the room into an operating theater where his dignity was being surgically removed. A cruel, rhythmic chanting began to rise from the tables like steam. "Careful, Limp! Watch your step, Prince!" The voice belonged to Connor Hale, a linebacker with a neck as thick as a tree trunk and a mind narrowed by years of unchecked privilege. He held EJ's crutch high above his head, waving it back and forth like a trophy won in a war that only one side knew they were fighting. Beside him stood Jason Miller, the uncrowned king of the school, his blonde hair slicked back, a smirk cutting across his face that suggested he owned the air everyone else was breathing. "Billionaire Baby can't even stand on his own 2 feet," Jason sneered, his voice carrying easily over the rising murmur of the crowd. He stepped forward, his designer sneakers crunching on a piece of broken ceramic, and shoved EJ hard in the chest. EJ stumbled back, his uneven gait betraying him. Without the crutch, he was a ship without an anchor in a hurricane. He flailed, his expensive blazer soaking up the spilled juice, staining the fabric a sickly amber. The crowd didn't gasp, they howled. It was a primal sound, the noise of a pack sensing a wounded animal. Hundreds of smartphones shot into the air instantly, their red recording lights blinking like the hungry eyes of wolves in the dark. They weren't there to help, they were there to capture the content. In this ecosystem, cruelty was currency, and EJ was about to make everyone rich. "Fight! Fight! Fight!" The chant started at the varsity table and spread like a contagion. EJ felt the familiar sting of tears pricking his eyes, a weakness he hated more than his leg. He remembered his mother's voice then, a ghost whispering through the noise. "The stars don't care how fast you walk, EJ." But looking around at the sea of mocking faces, the distorted reflections in the glass walls, he knew the stars weren't watching. Only the cameras were. He curled his shoulders inward, trying to make himself small, trying to disappear into the floor. But then the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a sudden drop in pressure. At a far table near the exit, where the scholarship kids usually made themselves invisible, a pair of chopsticks was set down with deliberate, terrifying precision. Amara Johnson stood up. She didn't rush. In a room fueled by adrenaline and chaos, her movement was jarringly slow. She wore thrift store jeans that had been washed until they were nearly white at the knees and a hoodie that had seen better decades, but she moved with the regal bearing of a queen entering her court. The noise in the cafeteria didn't stop, but the students in her direct path fell silent, parting instinctively as she walked toward the center of the room. Amara's eyes weren't on the crowd. They weren't even on Jason or Connor. They were fixed on the spilled tray. She walked straight into the kill zone, the space between the bullies and their victim. Jason noticed her first. His smirk widened, sensing fresh meat. "Well, look who it is," he laughed, gesturing to his sycophants. "The charity case." "What are you gonna do, wash the floor for us? I think that's in your scholarship contract, isn't it?" Connor laughed, a low, guttural sound, and swung the crutch like a baseball bat. "Go sit down, poor girl. This is varsity business." Amara ignored them entirely. She bent down, her movements fluid and efficient, and picked up the plastic tray. She set it on the nearest table. Then she turned to EJ. For a second, the chaos of the room fell away. She looked at him not with pity, which he despised, but with a steady, iron-clad recognition. "Stand up," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a diamond through glass. Jason's face flushed. To be ignored was the one insult he couldn't process. He stepped into Amara's personal space, looming over her. "I'm talking to you, trash. Get out of the way or you're gonna get hurt." He reached out to shove her just as he had shoved EJ. It was a move he had used 1,000 times, a display of dominance that relied on the other person flinching. Amara didn't flinch. As Jason's hand shot toward her shoulder, Amara didn't block it. She didn't strike back. Instead, she stepped slightly to the left, a movement so subtle it barely looked like she had moved at all. At the same moment, her hand came up, brushing the inside of Jason's wrist. It looked like a caress, but the physics of it were devastating. She guided his momentum past her, adding just a fraction of her own energy to his forward motion. Jason, expecting resistance, found only empty air. His heavy frame lurched forward, his center of gravity collapsing. He stumbled, his expensive sneakers sliding on the spilled pasta sauce, and he went down hard, face first into the metal legs of a cafeteria table. The clang of his impact rang out like a bell. The cafeteria went deathly silent. The chant died in 300 throats simultaneously. Connor stared at his friend, then at Amara, his brain struggling to compute the geometry of what had just happened. Rage took over. "You little freak!" he roared. He dropped the crutch and charged, a 200-pound missile of aggression. He didn't bother with a shove. He swung a wild haymaker punch aimed right at her head. The crowd gasped. This was it, violence. But inside Amara's mind, it wasn't a fight. It was a memory. She was 10 years old again, standing on the splintered wood floor of her father's dojo in Detroit. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sun. "Strength isn't about hurting, Amara," her father's voice echoed, as clear as if he were standing beside her. "It's about control. Flow like water. Let their anger be their defeat." As Connor's fist tore through the air, Amara pivoted. She dropped her hips, grounding herself, and caught Connor's wrist with one hand while her other hand pressed gently against his elbow. She didn't pull, she rotated. Using his own charging velocity against him, she turned her body like a revolving door. Connor's feet left the floor. It was mesmerizing. He flipped through the air, his legs pinwheeling helplessly before he slammed flat onto his back on the tiles. The wind was knocked out of him with an audible whoosh. Amara stood over him, her breathing steady, her hands returning to her sides in an open, peaceful stance. She hadn't thrown a single punch. She hadn't even frowned. Jason scrambled up from the floor, blood dripping from a split lip, his eyes wild with humiliation. "Get her!" he screamed, lunging at her again, blind with fury. He tried to tackle her, but Amara simply sidelined him again. She stepped in, merged with his movement, and guided him into the wall. It wasn't a violent slam, it was a redirection. He hit the padded acoustic paneling and slid down, exhausted and defeated by his own wasted energy. Amara turned away from them. The bullies were panting, broken, and confused on the floor, while she looked as if she had just finished a light stretch. The recording lights on the phones were still blinking, but the energy behind them had changed. The hunger for blood had been replaced by a stunned, reverent awe. She walked over to where the crutch had fallen. She picked it up, dusted it off with a gentle pat, and walked back to EJ. The billionaire's son was staring at her, his mouth slightly open, trembling not from fear anymore, but from the shock of witnessing a miracle. Amara held the crutch out to him, her eyes locked with his, dark and bottomless. "Stand tall, EJ," she whispered. EJ reached out, his fingers closing around the cold aluminum. He planted it firmly on the ground. He took a breath, pushed his shoulders back, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look at the floor. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the bullies. And finally, he looked at the girl who had just rewritten the laws of physics and social hierarchy in under 30 seconds. "Yes," EJ whispered back, his voice finding its footing. The silence held for one more second, fragile and perfect, before the cafeteria doors burst open with a noise that sounded like a gunshot. Vice Principal Sinclair didn't walk into a room, she invaded it. The heavy double doors slammed against the walls, the sound cracking like a judge's gavel, shattering the fragile silence Amara and EJ had created. Sinclair was a woman who wore authority like a suit of armor, her eyes sharp and constantly scanning for insubordination. In the ecosystem of Crestwood Academy, she was the predator at the top of the food chain, usually tasked with ensuring the donor families remained happy and the scholarship students remained invisible. She took one look at the scene, Jason Miller groaning against the wall, Connor Hale still trying to remember how to breathe on the floor, and Amara Johnson standing over them, and her narrative was instantly written. It didn't matter that Amara's hands were open and empty. It didn't matter that EJ was trembling. What mattered was the optic. The Golden Boys were down, and the girl from the wrong side of the tracks was the last one standing. "Johnson!" Sinclair's voice was a serrated blade. She marched across the cafeteria, her heels striking the floor with militaristic precision. "Step away from them, now!" Amara didn't flinch, nor did she retreat. She simply turned, her expression unreadable, and bowed her head slightly, not in submission, but in a gesture of calm acknowledgement that infuriated Sinclair even more. "Assault!" Sinclair hissed, arriving at the center of the chaos. She pointed a manicured finger at Amara's chest. "Expulsion won't even cover this. I want you in my office immediately, and someone call the police. I want this documented." "No." The word hung in the air, soft but undeniable. Sinclair spun around, stunned that anyone would interrupt her sentencing. It was EJ. He had stepped forward, placing himself between the vice principal and Amara. He leaned heavily on his crutch, his knuckles white, but his chin was lifted. "Excuse me, Mr. Whitmore." Sinclair's tone softened instantly, shifting from prosecutor to concerned aunt. "I know you're shaken. We'll get the nurse. Clearly, this individual attacked you and your friends." "She didn't attack anyone," EJ said, his voice gaining traction, shedding the rasp of fear. "She saved me." Sinclair blinked, her internal script malfunctioned. "Jason is bleeding, Elijah. Connor is on the floor. Amara is standing. The physics of the situation are quite clear." "The physics are clear," a new voice cut in. "But your conclusion is trash." From the crowd, a junior named Jasmine stepped forward. She was holding her phone up like a lantern in the dark. Beside her, 3 other students stood up, then 10. The fear that usually governed the room was evaporating, replaced by the intoxicating feeling of righteousness. Jasmine didn't wait for permission. She walked straight to the wall-mounted smart screen used for daily announcements and tapped her phone against the casting receiver. "You want documentation," Jasmine said, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm. "Here." The massive screen flickered to life. The cafeteria held its collective breath. The video started in high definition. It showed everything, the cruel smirk on Jason's face, the way Connor waved the crutch like a savage trophy, the shove that sent the juice flying. The audio was crisp, amplifying the chant that had filled the room moments ago. "Fight, fight, fight." And then Amara. On the screen, she moved like a glitch in the Matrix. The video played in real time, but her stillness made everyone else look frantic. Sinclair watched, her mouth slightly ajar, as the girl she had just threatened with expulsion neutralized 2 varsity athletes without ever closing her fist. It was undeniable. Jason's momentum was his undoing. Connor's aggression was his own trap. Amara was merely the wall they had crashed against. The video ended with Amara handing the crutch back to EJ. "Stand tall." The screen went black, but the image was burned into 300 retinas. Sinclair stood frozen, the silence in the room weighing on her like a physical burden. The narrative she had constructed, the violent scholarship kid attacking the innocent wealthy students, had just been nuked. She looked at Jason, who was now pulling himself up using the table, wiping blood from his lip. He looked small. For the first time since kindergarten, the boy who owned the school looked entirely ordinary. "That video," Sinclair stammered, smoothing her skirt, desperate to regain control, "is context. However, violence is zero tolerance. Both sides." "There was no both sides," EJ interrupted, his voice ringing out. "There was a bully and there was a shield. You don't punish the shield for the sword's mistake." A slow clap started from the back of the room. It wasn't mocking. It was heavy, rhythmic, and respectful. It picked up speed, spreading from the drama club table to the debate team, sweeping through the varsity benches where Jason's own teammates sat. Within seconds, the cafeteria was thundering with applause. It was a jury verdict delivered by the student body. Jason glared at Amara, his ego fractured beyond repair. "This isn't over, charity girl," he spat, though the threat lacked its usual venom. "My dad." "Your dad can't buy gravity, Jason," Amara said. It was the first time she had spoken to him directly since the fight. Her voice was calm, almost bored. "And he can't buy the truth. If you want to try again, I'll be here. But next time, try not to trip over your own ego." She turned to EJ, offering him a faint, barely there smile. "You okay?" EJ nodded, feeling a strange sensation in his chest. It was pride, not the hollow pride of his father's bank account, but something he had built himself in the last 5 minutes. "Yeah, I think I am." The bell rang, shattering the tension, but nobody moved. They were witnessing the birth of a legend. Amara hoisted her backpack onto her shoulder, the zipper snagging as usual, and began to walk out. The sea of students parted for her again, but this time they weren't backing away in confusion. They were making way out of respect. But while the school day limped on, the digital world was already sprinting. Jasmine's video hadn't just gone to the smart screen, it had gone to the cloud. By the time the final period bell rang, the clip was viral. It had migrated from a private Snapchat group to TikTok, and from there the algorithm took over. The caption was simple: "Scholarship girl folds bullies like laundry, Justice Crestwood." The views skyrocketed, 10,000 in the first hour, 50,000 by lunch, 500,000 by the time the private cars lined up for pickup. The internet loves a hero, but it loves a vigilante even more. People dissected the footage frame by frame. Martial arts forums lit up with debates about her form. Was it Aikido? Judo? Hapkido? They analyzed her footwork, her center of gravity, the absolute serenity on her face. But amidst the viral frenzy, the context began to bleed out. The world started to ask who these kids were. E.J. Whitmore knew who he was supposed to be. He was the crippled prince, the son of Richard Whitmore, a man whose net worth was discussed on financial news channels. E.J. lived in a penthouse that floated above the city clouds, a glass cage of luxury. But inside that cage, he was starving. His mother, Clara, had been the warmth in that cold house. She was the one who had whispered stories about constellations to distract him from the pain of his surgeries. The stars shine for you anyway. When cancer took her, it took the light out of the apartment. Richard Whitmore tried to fill the void with the best doctors, the best tutors, and the best gadgets. But he couldn't buy the one thing E.J. needed: presence. Richard treated E.J.'s disability like a plummeting stock, something to be managed, corrected, and kept out of the public eye until it stabilized. And Amara, the internet sleuths were digging for her, too. They found a ghost story. Amara Johnson was the daughter of Anthony "The Wall" Johnson, a local legend in the crumbling neighborhoods of Detroit. He hadn't been rich, but he had been rich in principle. He ran a dojo that barely made rent, teaching kids that the ultimate weapon was peace. He taught Amara that fighting for ego was a weakness, but fighting to protect the weak was a sacred duty. When a heart attack claimed him 2 years ago, Amara inherited nothing but his code and his debts. Her mother, Yvonne, worked double shifts as a nurse just to keep Amara in Crestwood, believing that the shiny halls offered a better future. They didn't know those halls were filled with sharks, 2 children both defined by what they had lost. One lost a mother and gained a cold fortune. The other lost a father and gained a warrior's discipline. As the sun began to set over the city skyline, the video continued its relentless climb across the globe. It was about to land on the one screen that mattered most. In a boardroom 40 stories up, a meeting was dragging on. Richard Whitmore was rubbing his temples, bored by the acquisition numbers, when his phone buzzed against the mahogany table. It was a news alert, but not from the stock market. Viral video: bullying incident at Crestwood Academy involving Whitmore heir. Richard froze. His breath caught in his throat. He unlocked his phone, his finger hovering over the play button. He didn't know it yet, but the merger he was negotiating was about to become the least important thing in his life. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Whitmore Tower was hermetically sealed from the world below. It was a place where temperature, lighting, and sound were engineered for maximum efficiency. 12 people sat around a table that cost more than most American homes, waiting for Richard Whitmore to speak. He was the sun in this solar system. Nothing moved until gravity dictated it. But Richard wasn't looking at the quarterly projections for the Asian markets. He was looking at his phone, a device he usually treated as a grenade: pull the pin, bark an order, throw it to an assistant. Today, however, he held it like it was a piece of evidence in a murder trial. Play. The video on the screen was shaking, filmed by a student's hand, but the image was clear enough to stop Richard's heart. He saw the cafeteria. He recognized the Crestwood crest on the wall, and then he saw his son. E.J. was backing away, his posture collapsed in on itself. Richard knew that posture. He had seen it at the dinner table, in the hallway, in the rearview mirror. For years, Richard had interpreted it as weakness, a lack of grit that needed to be ironed out with tougher tutors and stricter expectations. But seeing it now, framed by the jeering faces of boys who looked like sharks in designer clothing, Richard finally saw it for what it was: terror. He watched Connor Hale raise the crutch. He saw the juice splash against E.J.'s chest. Richard's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned the color of bone. A primal, dormant instinct roared to life in his chest, a father's rage. He wanted to reach through the gorilla glass and tear the room apart. He wanted to buy the school and burn it down. But then the girl stepped into the frame. Richard didn't know Amara Johnson. To him, she was just a blur of denim and gray cotton. But he knew power when he saw it, and he knew leverage. As a CEO, he spent his life studying how people moved, how they negotiated, how they held ground. He watched this girl walk into the center of a riot with the calmness of someone walking into a library. He watched her set the tray down. He watched her hand the crutch back. And then he watched the fight. Richard had expected a brawl. He expected hair pulling, screaming, the messy chaos of children. Instead, he saw physics. He saw the way she pivoted, the way she used the bully's own aggression as a fulcrum to flip the script. It was efficient. It was brutal in its simplicity. It was beautiful. "Mr. Whitmore," the CFO cleared his throat, nervous. "The merger timeline." Richard didn't look up. "Quiet." The word was spoken softly, but it sucked the air out of the room. He hit replay. He needed to see it again. He needed to understand. This time, he turned the volume up. Sound of the cafeteria chanting "Fight, fight, fight" filled the silent boardroom, echoing off the glass walls. He watched Amara dismantle the boys again. But this time he focused on what happened after. He watched her lean in. He saw his son's face, pale, terrified, transform, stand tall. The words were barely audible over the cheering crowd in the video, but they hit Richard with the force of a physical blow. Stand tall. The memory ambushed him. He was suddenly back in a hospital room 5 years ago. The machines were beeping a slow, dying rhythm. Clara was lying there, her skin translucent, her hand holding EJ's small, trembling fingers. She had looked at Richard with eyes that were tired but fierce. "He needs you to be his ground, Richard. Not his ceiling, just let him stand." Richard had failed her. He had spent the last 5 years trying to fix EJ's legs, trying to buy him the best surgeons, the best prosthetics, the best future. He had tried to build a ceiling so high that the sky wouldn't matter, but he had never just let the boy stand. He had been so busy being a billionaire that he had forgotten to be a dad. He looked back at the screen. The video was looping, EJ saying, "Yes, it is." The strength in his son's voice was foreign to Richard. It was a strength Richard hadn't given him. That girl had. Richard minimized the video and opened a search bar. He typed the name from the video caption, Amara Johnson, Crestwood. The results were sparse. No society pages, no galas, no vacation photos in the Hamptons. Instead, he found a grainy photo from a local community paper dated 3 years ago. It showed a younger Amara standing in a dojo with cracked floorboards and peeling paint. Beside her stood a man who looked like he was carved out of granite and kindness. Master Anthony Johnson. 1978-2023. Obituary. Richard clicked the link. He read about a man who had turned down professional fighting contracts to teach at-risk youth in Detroit. A man who taught that the highest form of martial arts was the one where you never threw a punch. Protect the weak. Discipline over ego. Richard stared at the photo of the father and daughter. He looked at the pride in Anthony Johnson's eyes, a pride that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with character. Richard looked at his own reflection in the black screen of his phone. He saw a man in a $5,000 suit who didn't know his own son half as well as this girl knew him after 5 minutes. He stood up. The leather chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Mr. Whitmore?" The board members looked alarmed. "We haven't voted." "Cancel the vote," Richard said, his voice flat. He grabbed his jacket. "Sir, this is the acquisition of the decade if we walk out now." "I said cancel it," Richard snapped, turning to face them. His eyes were cold, but there was a fire behind them that none of them had seen in years. "Reschedule it for next week, or I don't care." "Where are you going?" his assistant asked, scrambling to grab her tablet. "You have the mayor at 3 and the investors at 5. "I'm going to school," Richard said. He walked out of the boardroom, leaving 12 of the most powerful people in the city staring at an empty chair. Didn't wait for the elevator. He took the stairs down 2 flights to the executive garage, his mind racing faster than his feet. As he slid into the back of his waiting sedan, the driver looked in the rearview mirror, confused. "The airport, sir." "Crestwood Academy," Richard said, "and get me there fast." As the car sliced through the afternoon traffic, Richard watched the video a 3rd time. He wasn't watching the fight anymore. He was watching the interaction. He saw the way Amara didn't gloat. She didn't pose for the cameras. She neutralized the threat, checked on the victim, and stood her ground. He opened the Notes app on his phone. Usually this was filled with acquisition targets and ruthless negotiation tactics. He typed a new line. "Ask, don't assume." He stared at the words. For years, he had assumed EJ was weak because of his leg. He had assumed the bullying was just boys being boys that EJ needed to toughen up against. He had assumed that providing wealth was the same as providing support. He typed another line. Support what already exists. He didn't need to swoop in and save EJ. EJ had already been saved. He didn't need to buy the school and fire the principal, though the temptation was sweet. He needed to understand the force that had just walked into his son's life. He pulled up the contact info for his private investigator, a man usually reserved for corporate espionage. He typed a message. "Find out everything about the Johnson family. Not the dirt, the debts, the needs. Do it quietly. I want to know who holds the mortgage on that dojo." He hit send and looked out the window. The skyline of the city rushed by, a blur of steel and glass. For the first time, the buildings didn't look like monuments to his success. They looked like cages. Richard Whitmore was a man who solved problems with checks. If a pipe burst, he bought a new plumbing company. If a law was inconvenient, he lobbied to change it. But as the car turned onto the tree-lined avenue leading to Crestwood Academy, he realized he was facing a problem his money couldn't solve. He couldn't buy back the years he had missed. He couldn't write a check to fix the humiliation his son had endured while he was busy merging corporations. The car pulled up to the curb. The school looked like a castle, imposing and perfect. Tesla doors were opening up and down the line, chauffeurs waiting for the scions of the elite. Richard opened his own door before his driver could get to it. He stepped onto the sidewalk. He adjusted his tie, not to look powerful, but to steady his hands. He wasn't going in there as the CEO of Whitmore Industries. He was going in as EJ's dad, and for the first time in a long time, he was terrified he wouldn't make the cut. When Richard Whitmore walked into the administrative wing of Crestwood Academy, the air pressure in the building seemed to change. The receptionists, usually gatekeepers of the highest order, scrambled to their feet. They were used to seeing him on the covers of Forbes or hearing his name whispered in fundraising galas, not seeing him storm past the ficus plants with his tie slightly loosened and a look of absolute determination etched onto his face. "Mr. Whitmore," the head secretary stammered, reaching for a phone. We weren't expecting you. Principal Harrington is in a meeting with Vice Principal Sinclair regarding the incident. I can try to slot you in for next Tuesday." Richard didn't even break stride. "I'm not here for a slot, Susan. I'm here for my son." He pushed open the heavy oak doors to the principal's office without knocking. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with damage control. Principal Harrington, a man who wore boadies to distract from his lack of backbone, was sweating through his collar. Vice Principal Sinclair was pacing, a phone pressed to her ear, frantically trying to explain to a donor why their child appeared in a viral video cheering for a fight. They both froze as Richard entered. Sinclair lowered her phone slowly. Harrington stood up so fast his chair tipped over. "Richard, I mean Mr. Whitmore," Harrington sputtered, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "We are handling the situation. Zero tolerance, as you know. We are preparing statements. The students involved will be disciplined quietly to avoid further scandal." "Quietly," Richard repeated the word, tasting the bile in it. He walked to the window, looking out at the courtyard where students were congregating, phones still glued to their hands. "You think you can handle this quietly? Have you checked the internet, Harrington? There is nothing quiet about what happened in that cafeteria." Sinclair stepped forward, regaining her composure. "Mr. Whitmore, surely you understand your son. His condition. It makes him a target. We try to protect him, but this girl, Amara Johnson, she escalated the situation into violence. We have to consider the liability." Richard turned on her slowly. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Escalated?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "I watched the video, Miss Sinclair. I watched it 3 times. I saw a girl de-escalate a threat that you and your staff allowed to fester for months. She didn't escalate anything. She finished it." He pulled a chair out and sat down, not waiting for an invitation. "There will be no quiet discipline. There will be no sweeping this under the rug to protect the endowments from the Miller and Hale families. Tomorrow morning, you're going to call an assembly, a mandatory one." Harrington wiped his forehead. "An assembly, sir, that's highly irregular. Might incite. It will incite the truth," Richard cut him off. "Jason Miller and Connor Hale will stand in front of their peers. They will apologize, and not the PR scripted apology their fathers' lawyers will write for them. A real one, or else." Richard let the sentence hang, heavy with the weight of his entire legal and financial arsenal. "Or else I pull the funding for the new science wing, the library renovation, and the stadium, and then I release a statement explaining exactly why." The silence that followed was absolute. The checkmate was delivered. The next morning, the Crestwood cafeteria was transformed. It wasn't a lunchroom anymore, it was a courtroom. The tables were pushed back, leaving a wide open space in the center. The student body was packed in, shoulder to shoulder, a sea of blazers and nervous energy. The buzz of conversation was deafening, 1,000 whispers speculating on what was about to happen. At the front of the room, standing like prisoners awaiting a verdict, were Jason Miller and Connor Hale. Their swagger was gone. Jason, usually the golden god of the hallways, looked shrunken. His lip was swollen, a purple souvenir from his meeting with the table, but the real damage was to his ego. Connor stood beside him, staring at his shoes, his face pale. Behind them, their parents stood in a grim line, mothers clutching pearls, fathers checking their watches, all of them radiating a mixture of embarrassment and annoyance that they had been summoned for something so trivial. But to the students, this wasn't trivial. This was history. Principal Harrington stepped to the microphone, tapping it nervously. The feedback screech silenced the room. Good morning. We are here to address yesterday's events. Crestwood Academy values, respect, and dignity. He rushed through the preamble, eager to be done with it. He gestured to the boys. Jason stepped forward first. His father gave him a sharp nudge in the small of the back. Jason looked up, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on EJ and Amara, who stood together near the front. EJ was leaning on his crutch, but he wasn't hunching anymore. He was standing upright, his head high. Amara stood next to him, hands in her pockets, her expression calm and unbothered. I. Jason's voice cracked. He cleared his throat. I'm sorry for what happened yesterday. It was inappropriate. I shouldn't have shoved you, EJ, or spilled your drink. It was a hollow apology, the kind spoken by someone who is sorry they got caught, not sorry for what they did. He stepped back, looking at the floor. Connor mumbled something into the microphone that sounded vaguely like "my bad" and retreated just as quickly. A ripple of dissatisfaction went through the room. The students knew fake when they heard it. They had seen the cruelty in the video. They wanted true accountability. Harrington stepped back up. Thank you, boys. Now we hope we can put this behind us and... No. The word cut through the auditorium air like a whip. It didn't come from Richard, who was watching silently from the back of the room. It came from Amara. She walked into the center of the open space. She didn't ask for the microphone. She didn't need it. Her voice projected with the clarity of someone who had trained her diaphragm as much as her fists. Don't apologize to us, Amara said, looking Jason dead in the eye. You think you pushed EJ because he has a limp? You think you came after me because I have second-hand shoes? She turned slowly, addressing the entire room. They didn't target us because we were weak. They targeted us because they needed to feel strong, and that's not an accident, it's a habit. She turned back to the bullies. Apologize to everyone else. Jason blinked, confused. What? Apologize to the freshman whose books you knocked over last week, Amara said, her voice steady. Apologize to the girl whose art project you ruined because you thought it was funny. Apologize to every single person in this room you made small just so you could feel big, because we weren't your first targets. We were just the last ones who were going to take it. The room went completely still. This wasn't just about a tray of spilled juice anymore. Amara was pulling the thread that held the entire social hierarchy of Crestwood together. She was exposing the culture of silence that allowed kings like Jason to rule. Jason looked at the crowd. He saw the faces, hundreds of them. He saw the freshmen he had tormented. He saw the debate team captain he had mocked. For the first time, he didn't see fans or subjects. He saw witnesses. His arrogance finally cracked. The facade crumbled, leaving just a scared kid who realized he was outnumbered. I'm sorry, Jason whispered, then louder, his voice trembling for real this time. I'm sorry to everyone. Connor nodded frantically beside him, his face flushed red. We were wrong, it won't happen again. The applause that started wasn't the polite golf clap of a school assembly. It was a roar. It started with Jasmine, the girl with the video, and spread like wildfire. Students were stomping their feet, cheering, some even crying. It was the sound of a dam breaking, the release of years of pent-up frustration against a system that had protected the cruel. In the back of the room, Richard Whitmore leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. He felt a stinging sensation in his eyes that he hadn't felt since Clara's funeral. He watched his son, EJ, standing in the middle of that thunderous applause. EJ wasn't looking at the floor. He was looking at Amara, and then he looked across the room and locked eyes with his father. Richard nodded. A small, subtle gesture. I see you. EJ smiled. It was a genuine, full smile that lit up his face. Amara didn't smile. She just watched the bullies retreat to their parents, stripped of their power, reduced to ordinary boys. She had delivered justice without throwing a single punch today. She turned to EJ and placed a hand on his shoulder. See, she whispered, barely audible over the cheering. Gravity works both ways. Sometimes the bigger they are, the harder they fall. The assembly began to disperse, but the energy was different. The cliques didn't reform in the same way. The lines had been blurred. But as the students filed out, Richard pushed off the wall. He had one more meeting to take, and this one wasn't with the principal. It was with the girl who had done the job he should have been doing for years. He walked toward Amara and EJ, his expensive Italian loafers clicking on the linoleum. The crowd parted for him, the famous billionaire, but he didn't notice them. He only saw the two kids standing in the center of the storm. EJ, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. Dad, EJ looked surprised, almost wary. What are you doing here? Richard looked at his son, really looked at him. Then he turned to Amara. He extended a hand, not the handshake of a CEO closing a deal, but the hand of a man offering respect. Amara Johnson, Richard said. I believe I owe you a thank you. And perhaps an apology of my own. Amara looked at the hand extended toward her. It was manicured, soft from years of holding nothing heavier than a fountain pen or a crystal tumbler. Her own hand was different, calloused along the ridge of the palm, knuckles slightly roughened from striking the makiwara board in her father's dojo. When she reached out and gripped Richard Whitmore's hand, the contrast was stark, but her grip was firm. She didn't squeeze to impress, she held on to connect. "You don't owe me an apology, Mr. Whitmore," Amara said, her voice dropping to a register that only the three of them could hear amidst the dispersing crowd. "But you might owe him a listen." She tilted her head toward EJ. Richard felt the sting of the truth, sharp and cleansing. He looked at his son. For years, he had seen EJ as a problem to be solved, a broken asset to be fixed with the best medical engineering money could buy. He had missed the man growing inside the boy. He withdrew his hand and placed it gently on EJ's shoulder. "I'm ready to listen," Richard said, his voice thick. "Dinner, just us, no phones, no board members." EJ looked at his father, searching for the old impatience, the ticking clock that usually accompanied their interactions. He found only patience. "Yeah, Dad," EJ smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "Just us." That evening, the penthouse suite at the top of the Whitmore Tower felt different. Usually the space was cold, a museum of modern art and silence. But tonight, the expansive living room was filled with the low hum of conversation. Richard sat on the velvet sofa, his jacket discarded, tie undone. Beside him, EJ sat with his tablet, replaying the video, not the fight, but the aftermath. Richard watched the screen over his son's shoulder. He saw himself in the pixels of his memory, absent for so many of these moments. "Your mother always said someone would come along and help you stand tall," Richard murmured, the grief for his late wife suddenly feeling less like a weight and more like a guide. "I think we just met her." EJ paused the video on the frame where Amara's hand rested on his shoulder. He turned to his father. "No, Dad, she didn't just help me stand." EJ's voice was steady, lacking the tremor that had defined his childhood. "She helped you, too." The words hung in the air, heavy and true. Richard realized that in his pursuit of legacy and empire, he had almost lost the only legacy that actually mattered. He wrapped an arm around his son, pulling him into a hug that was clumsy but desperate. It was the embrace of a man realizing he had been drowning and had finally found the surface. In that penthouse, high above the city lights, wealth and privilege felt infinitely smaller than the two things money had never been able to buy them: courage and connection. But the story didn't end in the penthouse. 2 days later, a black town car pulled up to a curb in a neighborhood Richard Whitmore had never visited. The pavement was cracked and the streetlights flickered with an uncertain hum. The building in front of him was modest, a brick structure with peeling paint and a sign that read Johnson's Dojo, discipline over ego. Richard stepped out. He didn't bring his security team. He didn't bring a camera crew. He walked to the door and pushed it open. The smell hit him instantly, sweat, old wood, and lemon oil. It was the smell of hard work. The main room was empty save for a girl sweeping the mats in the center. Amara looked up, stopping her broom. She didn't look surprised. "Mr. Whitmore," she nodded respectfully. "Amara," Richard said, stepping onto the wood but staying off the mats, respecting the boundary. He looked around at the photos on the wall, black and white images of a smiling man with gentle eyes. Master Anthony Johnson. "I looked up your father. He seemed like a good man." "He was the best man," Amara said simply. Richard reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a checkbook. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a deed. "I did some digging. I found out that the building's lease was owned by a holding company that's been raising the rent, trying to push you out for a condo development." Amara's grip on the broom tightened. She braced herself for the pity, for the charity. "I bought the holding company this morning," Richard said quietly. He walked over and placed the paper on a bench. "The building is yours, not a lease, a deed, paid in full, in your name." Amara stared at the paper. "Why?" "Because," Richard said, looking at the photo of her father, "my son told me you taught him how to stand. I can't pay you for that. There isn't enough money in my accounts to pay for that. But I can make sure that the place where you learn to stand never falls down." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "And Amara, if you ever need a sparring partner for EJ, he's been asking for lessons. I think he's ready to learn the code." Amara smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "Send him over, Mr. Whitmore. The mats are always open." Back at Crestwood Academy, the atmosphere had permanently shifted. The hierarchy of cruelty had been dismantled, not by administrative decrees, but by a cultural revolution. The cool table wasn't reserved for the rich kids anymore. It was just a table. Jason and Connor still walked the halls, but they walked with heads lower, their influence evaporated like mist. They had learned that fear is a fragile currency, easily bankrupt by a single act of courage. EJ walked the corridors with a new rhythm. His limp was still there, the doctors couldn't fix that, but his stride was different. He didn't hug the walls. He walked down the center of the hallway, his crutch clicking a steady beat that sounded less like a medical aid and more like a metronome for his own life. And Amara? She remained Amara. She didn't become the queen bee. She didn't trade her thrift store hoodie for designer gear. She continued to eat her rice and beans, continued to study, and continued to observe. But now, when she walked into a room, the whispers weren't about her shoes. They were about her spirit. She had taught the school a lesson that no textbook could cover. The loudest person in the room is rarely the strongest. This story traveled far beyond the polished halls of Crestwood. It rippled out through the viral videos, through the hashtags, and into the homes of millions. It became a mirror for every kid who felt invisible, showing them that their silence wasn't weakness. It was potential waiting for a spark. It became a warning for every bully who mistook kindness for cowardice, reminding them that the calmest water often hides the deepest strength. This is Black Stories, where the pain of prejudice is told and justice always finds its voice. We tell these stories not just to entertain, but to remind you that in a world that often rewards the loud and the ruthless, there is a profound power in discipline. Amara Johnson didn't need wealth to change her world. She carried her father's code like fire in her veins. She proved that you don't fight hate with hate, you fight it with truth. You don't fight ego with ego, you fight it with dignity. If you believe that schools should be sanctuaries for courage, not arenas for cruelty, then lean in. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of a time you stood up or wished you had like this video, share it for every child who is currently walking with their eyes on the floor, praying for a shield. Be that shield. And hit subscribe because we share more stories like this every week. Stories where the underestimated rise, where the arrogant collapse under their own weight, and where we learn that sometimes the quietest one in the room delivers the loudest lesson. Courage only wins when we refuse to look away. Stand tall.